your cable or satellite provider.
Tonight's event marks the occasion of Malcolm X's untimely death on February 21st, 1965. Since 2002, the Schomburg Center has been the home to the Malcolm X collection of papers, photographs, audio and visual items, as well as other personal items. Last summer, we expanded the collection and announced the acquisition of several new items, including the full 241-page manuscript of the Autobiography of Malcolm X with handwritten corrections and notes from both Malcolm X and collaborator Alex Haley. It also included a previously unpublished chapter from the book, believed to be omitted from the publication after Malcolm X's assassination. The 25-page typewritten chapter, titled The Negro, is thought to be one of 3 unpublished chapters in existence. And last, we also received a series of literal and literary fragments or short notes and drafts by Malcolm X written or typed on small pieces of paper. Next up, we're going to hear remarks from Sister Aisha Al-Adawiya, who has been a dedicated steward of Malcolm X's legacy. We know her around here as Sister Aisha because she is also the program administrator for the Schomburg's Scholars in Residence program. She is the founder of the Malcolm X Museum, creator of the Betty Shabazz Awards, also held by the Women in Islam, which she co-founded. She can still remember the first time she heard Malcolm X speak. In a recent article titled "The Fraught Unforgettable: How Malcolm X's Legacy Lives On in America," she relates that people walked out of his lectures feeling empowered to make a difference in their life right then and there. She said she was personally taken by his social critique and his allusions to the struggles of others around the world. Please welcome Sister Aisha as she helps to set the tone for this evening.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, sisters and brothers. It's wonderful to see you all here again this year. We are going into our second decade here at the Schomburg Center hosting these commemorations for Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And I'd like to ask you to show your appreciation to the Schomburg Center for stepping up and hosting these kinds of events continuously and continually on our behalf. So thank you very much. Yeah? I'd like to ask us to take a moment of silence to remember our Black Shining Prince, please. So a moment, please. Thank you. You know, there is a verse in the Quran that reminds us not to think of people who are martyred as dead, but to think of them as alive, though we may not perceive them as such. So I think that in the case of Malcolm X, Hajj Malik Shabazz, this is certainly true. We feel that he has grown larger now than ever before, and that many more people, not only here at home, but around the world, celebrate this legacy and look to this example in the struggle for freedom and social justice. So the world owes Malcolm X a debt of gratitude for his sacrifice. And I ask us also to remember his family and be supportive in every way that we can. I also ask you to be supportive of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture as the institution that stepped up decades ago and allowed us to do this kind of programming at a time when it was not the popular thing to do, but it was certainly the right thing to do. So I encourage you to be supportive of this institution and come back and look at the incredible collection that we have certainly on Malcolm X, as Novella has shared with you, but the people who were around him, as you'll hear from the panelists also this evening, and other heroes and sheroes of our time and before. So again, I welcome you to the Schomburg Center, and I thank you for being consistent in your love for Malcolm X. Haj Malik Shabazz. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Sister Aisha. As you will see, our panelists represent a cross-section of scholarship and life experiences. They are here to help us consider potential new insight from our recent acquisitions and to discuss the lasting impact of the autobiography of Malcolm X. So first, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Vanessa K. Valdes. Dr. Valdes is the director of the Black Studies program at the City College of New York, CUNY. A graduate of Yale and Vanderbilt universities, her research interests focused on cultural production of peoples of African descent throughout the Americas, the United States, and Latin America, including the Caribbean and Brazil. She is the author of Oshun's Daughters, The Search for Womanhood in the Americas, and the most recent Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Next, please welcome Zaheer Ali. In February 2015, Zaheer Ali was featured narrator in CNN's one-hour documentary, Witness the Assassination of Malcolm X, and authored the accompanying essay for the documentary's website. He has taught college-level courses on Islam and Black America, Malcolm X, Prince Roger Nelson, and African American studies. Ali is currently the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society, where he records, collects, and curates the spoken word histories, testimonies, memoirs, and narratives of Brooklynites from all walks of life. In this capacity, he currently directs the Muslims in Brooklyn, a multi-year public arts and history project designed to amplify the histories of Muslims in Brooklyn. Previously, he served under the direction of the late Manning Marable as project manager and senior researcher of the Malcolm X Project at Columbia University, a multi-year research initiative on the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Next, please welcome Sana Simba. Born Bernard Sutton in Washington, D.C., Sana Simba grew up in a cycle of poverty, drugs, and violence that dominated inner-city life and culture in the 70s and 80s. Sana's drive and academic success got him into the prestigious Gonzaga College High School in Washington, D.C., and subsequently college. Sana's life grew increasingly complex as he straddled between living as a successful entrepreneur and businessman by day, and an ardent Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist who led radical consciousness-raising groups at night. As CEO and co-founder of Caribou Books, the most successful independent and Black-owned bookstore chain in the U.S., Sana's accumulated emotional wounds entangled with the duplicity of his life resulted in a devastating loss of everything Sana built. You can learn more about his story in his recent memoir, Never Stop. He enthusiastically told me that it was Malcolm X's life and teachings that influenced him to co-found Caribou Books. We will have a book signing with Sana Simba following tonight's conversation. Last but certainly not least, please welcome Dr. Lheureux Lewis-McCoy. Dr. Lewis-McCoy is an associate professor of sociology of education in the Sociology of Education program at New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His central line of research concentrates on educational inequality. Well, one time for the children in the house who know who their papa is. And I meant that in the best way possible. I realized that could have been taken in a different way. His central line of research concentrates on educational inequality, focused on the intersecting role of race, class, and place. His first book, Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling, examined the experiences of low-income and racial minority families, attempts at assessing school-related resources in an affluent suburb. His larger research interests include race and racism, gender justice, and community mobilization. After we hear from our panel, we invite the audience to join the conversation by using the mics at the back of the room for an audience Q&A. With that said, please take it over, Dr. Valdes.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming this evening. So my understanding is that we have 45 minutes of conversation, and so that's why my phone is next to me. So I wanted to start by asking the panel, what is your entry point to Malcolm X?
You know, I don't want to sound cliche, but it is the autobiography. I was in high school. Well, it's two things. It's the autobiography of Malcolm X and hip-hop. Mm-hmm. I was in high school, and we used to have to do book reports, and I remember my high school teacher assigning me a book, and I was also at that point where I was trying to understand or come up with a way of understanding race in America, and I was like, I don't want to read any more books by white people. And this was a black teacher, and so shout out to all of the public school teachers who see, who see opportunities to intervene in the lives of their students. And she intervened and said, well, why don't you read the autobiography of Malcolm X? And I remember it was a Friday. I checked the book out from the school library and took it home, and that was my weekend. Like, I couldn't put the book down. You know, Malcolm's just analysis of race, his experience of a student whose dreams and aspirations were being shot down, his just evolution throughout his life. And then as a Muslim, this book also spoke to me. Malcolm represented a publicly engaged Islam, Islam as a reform, Islam as a revolutionary kind of religion, and I was very excited. And while I was reading, the soundtrack in my ear was Public Enemy, and they, of course, had sampled Malcolm in Party for Your Right to Fight and a few other tracks, and so it was the culture and the story of Malcolm, and at the time, Malcolm came to represent a kind of intellectual coup. So, you know, people talk about how, like, being smart stigmatizes you in some public schools. Like, that was not my experience, because Malcolm, I would always, like, uphold Malcolm, and people would respect that. So there was no, like, peer pressure to not pursue learning. People were like, yeah, do that. And so that was my entry point to Malcolm.
Thank you.
Yeah, mine was maybe a bit colorful. I grew up in D.C., and in the group I hung around, I spent a lot of time in the streets selling drugs, owned a gun, was in a gang. And so I was the only guy in my group that was able to go to college. So I was able to escape. Education became my escape route. And so I sold my gun, I gave up selling drugs. So I'm on this predominantly white campus, but I'm still a street guy. And if you're talking about the 80s, I had my Fila sweatsuit, my New Balance tennis shoes, you know, everything. And so I'm in the classroom, and there's Dr. William Lawball, it was a writing class. There was a student, very popular student, and she was teasing my diction. I took offense, and she was a young lady, so I couldn't threaten her directly, so we got into it in class. So I told her, I said, well, you go find one of these white boys on campus, anyone you choose, and I will punish them for you, right? And so the teacher, hearing the disruption, pulled us out to class, and he called me to his office the next day. So I went up, and he said, you know, I'm ready to file a claim on your behalf of racism against her. And so I'm from the streets. I'm like, well, we just should knuckle up. I mean, that was what I'm proposing. Like, all this, you know, telling the authorities, that's not how we handle things. I had no interest in filing the claim, but I appreciated the, you know. So he said to me, he said, but you know, the way you handle things would not be the way Dr. King would handle things. I had heard of Dr. King. And then he said, I don't know why I didn't ask him. He said, now, have you heard of a book called Soul on Ice? I never had. So I went to the library, I checked the book out. I never returned that book, I still own it, right? So, and then when when I ran across Malcolm X, the first thing that grabbed me was the X was so mysterious. And I was like, why would somebody have the last name X? And then when I read about him, a mother who was mentally ill was put away in an institution in Kalamazoo, Michigan. His father was not in his life because he was allegedly killed by the Black Legion. My mother was mentally ill. I had never met my father, and to this day I still don't know who he was. Malcolm spent his time on the streets. I spent my time on the streets, the drugs, the guns, etc. I could relate to Malcolm, and it was for the first time in my life that I met a man, either in person or through reading, who I could connect to. And I wanted to emulate him as like a father. He became like a father figure to me. And I was on this campus, and so the other thing about Malcolm, the profundity, the deepness, and then hearing him speak, oh my goodness, I was blown away. And to this day, I've never heard anyone who could speak as effectively as Malcolm. And so immediately he became my patron saint. And so the other thing about Malcolm, he was also cool, so I could still be street, okay? And I could get good grades. And so Malcolm allowed me to transition from being a street guy to being, eventually I made the dean's list every single semester. I became a part of the student union. I started teaching. Some of the teachers in the college would actually invite me to their classes to teach Black history to the students. So Malcolm actually became like my gateway to becoming a better person, as well as making that transition from the streets to being in a college environment. So.
I think we all have, in ways similar, yet different ways of entry to the autobiography. So I was first introduced to the autobiography when I was starting high school, and I was going to a new school, and it was a historically white school, predominantly white, very affluent, and I remember them giving me a summer reading list, and I was like, what's this? And they were like, well, you have to read in the summer, and I was like, I'm not even in the school yet. This is a little bit ridiculous. And I knew that I was going to a place that didn't look like the schools that I'd been to. There were very few Black students, very few Latino students, and I saw this list of about 60 books. And I'm looking down and I'm seeing things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I'm like, I have no idea what this is. This doesn't sound like me. And then I was like, all right, I need to take this list, and I need to take it to my sister and ask her, who on this list is Black? Right? And so my sister, who was 2 years my senior, was like, all right, I'll find the Black people. There were 2 books, right, out of 60. And those 2 were the Autobiography of Malcolm X and James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Right? And I'll be honest, at the ripe age of 15, I didn't have that much appreciation for Baldwin. I was like, this language is a little bit complicated. There was more of a narrative flow, and I couldn't get with it. And so I was struggling with Baldwin, and then I got to the autobiography because I put down Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I picked up the autobiography, and I remember it was around the time that my mother's side of the family is from Selma, Alabama, and I was in New Haven, Connecticut. And so we were taking a trip to Selma. And if you grew up Black in America, you know often taking a trip means getting in a car. Right? And so we were driving from Connecticut to Selma, and I was like, I'll take this book with me. And as I started to read the book, I was immediately wrapped up in it, right? I felt connected to him as an individual. And it was the chapter Mascot that really caught me first. Because I started to think about the environments that I've been in, even when there were a number of Black students, where folks would look at me and single me out and be like, oh yeah, you're the smart Black boy, right? Sometimes they would use that language officially or do it unofficially in their actions, and it didn't feel like a compliment, but I never had the language to talk about it. And so when I read that chapter, I started to think more systematically about how education shapes and how our teachers impact our worldview, and often how the folks who are put in front of us to educate us bring in with them sets of prejudices and experiences and systems of racism. And so Mascot opened me up. And then I started to look more at his development and transformation. And this was the first time that I had read a book that really talked about a journey and a rites of passage for someone. Someone going and moving through different spaces, having one outlook on the world, being challenged by evidence, being challenged by reality, having setbacks, and changing who they were. And I was thinking, I want to change, right? I have folks in my life who were Black men, who were community members, who were father figures, but oftentimes they were so sold on giving me the narrative of who they were now, they wouldn't tell me about their past. So in the autobiography, I got access to some of that past that my father and my uncles wouldn't tell me about. Right. And so it started to, for me, it was a guide in many ways. And to this day, it's probably the book that I've gone back to the most, because as it represents an arc of change, each time I've gone back, I've seen different elements of myself. Right. I've seen ways in which Malcolm changed, that I've changed, and ways in which I'm still compelled to change. Right. So it's an iterative text for me.
Yeah. I want to say I grew up with that text in my house. We could clap for that. So I was born and raised here in New York City. I have my parents. My mother was born in Puerto Rico, came at 15. My father was born in El Barrio, right? Born in 1939. So there was no, in my family, there was no different, like us, we was New York City, period, right? My father I have uncles who ran the streets while my father was trying to make sure that the family, he was the oldest of 5, to make sure that the family was okay, because my granddaddy, God bless him, was running the streets. And so, so we grew up, that text was one of the texts that we had at home. And so I have an older sister as well who, it was well read. And so I say that because, well, you know, this is a mixed audience in that you may be compelled to think, oh, okay, of course it spoke to the black men on this panel, right? It spoke to me when I read it at 13 because, one, I had never seen articulated, as you said, that journey, right? Like the words put to it, right? Where I have family, I was the smart kid in my family, but I also had parents who hadn't been validated by the educational systems who loved to read. And so that's why I had a library in the house, because they both collected books, and so that was our gateway, right? That literacy component and what education could promise, irrespective of what your teacher would say to you, right? And so, yeah, just that journey, again, between how he grew up in the urban centers, right, of this country, right, between Detroit, Boston, Harlem. He's moving around a lot. My family did that as much, so I related to that. I also related to, I was pleasantly surprised by his forthrightness, because you didn't talk about folks who went to jail. Right? You didn't talk, it was just kind of a respectability issue there. So for this man to say, no, this is my journey. This is what I did, and yet, right? That promise. So he changed, obviously, right? He affected and changed lives in ways that we can't even measure, because we all have emotional responses, right, to this man and his journey. And what's interesting, a good number of us, Public Enemy did something for us, and I wanted to, you touched on hip hop, so I wanted to bring it back to that. What was that inflection point? How did that affect you? Particularly, of course, Spike Lee's movie, Public Enemy's public embrace, right, of Malcolm X. Again, at a time when it wasn't, we're coming out the 70s and the 80s, early 90s, we see a rise of a different kind of hip hop, right? So if y'all could speak.
Well, Malcolm, he spoke like a drummer. There was a very percussive quality to Malcolm's style of delivery. It was like rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. Whereas Martin was like a horn, like a trumpet. You can, the soaring you get in Martin. So Malcolm was really fit for weaving in and out of break beats, right? So I think the first album or the first track was No Sellout, which came out in 83. And it was just a break beat with Malcolm's either message to the grassroots or the Battle of the Bullet. I can't remember which of those speeches. And that, so he just, there was a musical quality to his speaking style. And if you listen to his speech, he knew how to take you on this rise and climax and denouement. He knew how to play the audience as a performer. And it's funny because he did moonlight as a drummer. I think his name was Carlton something, right? So it's clear that he had that knowledge of how to deliver in a way that was very, and so his style of delivery was very much suitable to hip-hop, and then his story, right, which was a northern, urban story fit the whole context that hip-hop was emerging in. I mean, and even his, it's funny, when I would teach the Zoot Suit era of Malcolm, which Malcolm downplays the consciousness of, right? But when you look at the history of the Zoot Suit, that to manufacture a zoot suit required using a whole lot of cotton, which violated the rations during World War II. So essentially this was illegal clothing. and the ways that clothing became criminalized in that context, and how we sometimes look at how hip-hop audiences or people who listen to hip-hop or hip-hop clothes or ways of dressing become criminalized. I see a lot of students just responding to the Detroit Red Malcolm, speaking to them with a cultural rebelliousness, maybe not a explicitly political articulation, but culturally it is a resistance against authority. It is a rebellion against kind of bourgeois notions of respectability. There is a class element there, and there's also a black and brown element there, because of course the zoot and even the conking originated from like the West Coast of like Chicano culture, right? So there is so much even in that Detroit Red Malcolm that lent itself so well to hip hop.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And for me, I think Malcolm's relationship to hip hop is he gave people, young black folks, and particularly young black men, the opportunity to be angry and intelligent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
The ability to see yourself as central to the community, but also question what you do to a community as well.
Yes.
And so when I would hear samplings of Malcolm, that's when I got introduced to Islam, right? Mm-hmm. So I grew up in a black Baptist household. And so the first time that I went to a mosque for the Nation of Islam, or first time I met folks from the Nation of Gods and Earth, it all came through hip-hop culture, right? And really trying to figure out, well, what are these lyrics and what are they referring back to, right? So who was the black man, who was the Negro, what's the 5%? And there's a whole lineage that laid behind the words that I encountered at first scratch. And the more you scratch, the more you wanted to know. And so Malcolm's vibrato and the way in which he worked to create a narrative of who he was fits really great with hip-hop artists, right? Hip-hop being an art form, particularly when the MC comes into prominence, you're seeing folks who are trying to tell their tale. Right. The autobiography becomes the perfect text to pull from. Right. Now, there are hazards in that too, right? Because if the autobiography becomes the Bible, that means the other set of texts that are also divine or sacred or meaningful don't get incorporated. Right. And sometimes our discourse around Malcolm can stick in a place. Right. So many people love the autobiography that reading anything else becomes unacceptable. Yes. Right? They're like, no. To read that biography, that's like, it's kind of haram. Like, no, actually, there's more than one way to see Malcolm. And if there's any lesson I think we can take from Malcolm, and often one of the lessons that I challenge my students around with hip-hop is just because you hear a voice articulate a thing in a moment doesn't mean they don't have other beliefs and other ways of understanding the world. Yeah. Sometimes we hold on to the dominant image and we forget what wraps around the person. Right.
Right, absolutely. And the idea of evolution, right? The idea of like this, certainly he talks about, right? His 20-year-old self was not his 39-year-old self, right? Could we talk a little bit about, you again, both of you mentioned this, this sacredness of this text, right? The attachment to these words, right? In terms of, you mentioned his skill, both of you mentioned his skill as an orator, as a rhetorician, right? As a performer, right? Because there are rhythms that one has when you're talking. So then how then do you take that image, right? His voice. We now have YouTube, right? But we have his voice in hip-hop songs, and then translate that onto a written text. This is what Alex Haley's challenge was, right? Like, how do you take this dynamic, charismatic man who, was first introduced to most of this country as the man who hates America, right? The angriest man in America, and yet folks fell in love with him, right? They were like, well, dang, maybe he's making some sense. Maybe he's saying some things. Maybe we are accountable in ways that we hadn't really thought of, right? So how do y'all wrestle with that tensions of the oral and the textual of this book?
Well, for me, it was fairly easy because the brilliant thing about Malcolm, like for example, I studied a lot of philosophy, and some philosophers, you may read like Kant, Immanuel Kant or something like that, and you may have to read it 3 or 4 times to understand like what he's trying to say, or like Schopenhauer. And then sometimes you realize that maybe they don't understand what they're talking about. Right. So Malcolm, his brilliance in that, his profoundness also was in his simplicity. He could take very complex ideas and break it down and speak to a group of people in Harlem, the downtrodden, uneducated. He could also go to Harvard, Michigan State, all around Howard University and speak to anybody, almost anywhere. And so for me, it was very easy to understand Malcolm and to put that into writing, with impacting my writing. And just he was radical. He was for the downtrodden, the working class. He was revolutionary. So me coming from the streets, I could relate because I felt there was some degree of guilt because I had lost some friends from the streets, and I felt like I had to give back. And so I saw that the system was unfair overall. And when I ran into Malcolm and his fight for fundamental change in the system, he wasn't about just like a simple reform. He wanted to either overthrow or overhaul the system. And so that appealed to me because a part of my mission was to come back and fight for people who had not had an opportunity to receive the education I was fortunate enough to have. I was the only guy in my group who went to private school, and my mother somehow convinced the Archdiocese to finance my education. All my other friends went to public school, and my best friend didn't even finish junior high school. So again, I had this, this commitment to uplift, and Malcolm again was my symbol. He was my guide in that regard. So, and then in terms of musically, I'm from D.C., and I have to admit, I know hip-hop is from New York. There was a time in the early 80s, very early 80s, when I'm from D.C., go-go music and hip-hop was like right here. Of course. And maybe I'm still a little upset that hip-hop is all around the world and go-go is like still localized. Y'all probably heard of Chuck Brown, but, and so I came back to Malcolm through jazz, okay? Yes. When I ran into John Coltrane, when I first heard jazz, it was just too much going on for me. Yeah. But then I ran into John Coltrane, Naima. I love ballads. Yeah. But then when the cassette tapes, if y'all remember cassette tapes, I would be busy driving, and I would, be focusing on the road, and I would forget to fast forward past Naima or to Naima. Then I fell in love with My Favorite Things and I just fell in love with John Coltrane, and he played it really, really hard. And so when I got into jazz, I realized like John Coltrane, like Malcolm, kind of revolutionized jazz. And once he played that saxophone, that tenor sax, he completely changed the game. He was like the Malcolm X of jazz. And then when I started reading about John Coltrane and him being in New York in the 60s and, whether he had actually seen Malcolm X speak, his impact on Malcolm or Malcolm's impact on him. So when I got into jazz, it kind of brought Malcolm back to me from that vantage point musically. Yeah. And then I'll talk about Earth, Wind & Fire later.
What's interesting when you look at the manuscript that's here, that the early draft of the autobiography that Alex Haley was working with, and you see their marginal comments, notes that Malcolm is making and Alex Haley is making. There's several portions in the autobiography where Alex Haley is like crossing out and saying, stop speechifying, show, don't tell, embed this in the story, or there's a story that better illustrates this. And I think that brings up the tension that you mentioned of how do you bring the brilliance of the orality of Malcolm in a literary, which is a very linear, right? Like a literary, most stories have in literature, have a very linear kind of presentation. There are people like Toni Morrison does the floating narrator or Faulkner or whatever, and you kind of which switching first person, second person, third person. But generally speaking, the writing of a story kind of brings a structure to it that orality doesn't require, right? So people can they can do that improvisational storytelling and come back and get the refrain, and so you remember what they were talking about, then they go off and then they come back and then they go off, and you can follow that rhythm much easier in speaking that you can't necessarily in writing. And so you get this tension in the text between Alex Haley and his desire to construct a linear narrative and Malcolm and his desire to kind of tell his story. And what's even more challenging is that Malcolm's perspective changes in the course of the storytelling. And normally, when someone is doing a memoir, they have to fix their time. And I'm going to tell the story from this day. Because every time we tell our story, we are actually inventing our history, right? And how we remember today might not be how we remember today next week, might not be how we remember today next year, because different things change the meaning of today.
Right.
And Malcolm began the autobiography as a tribute to the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the salvation that he found in those teachings. And while he's doing that, he, of course, becomes disillusioned with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and it becomes a very different text. And it's really hard to see how that weaves in and out, but he slips in foreshadowing. And there's parts where Alex Haley's like, don't spoil it yet. Like, you know, like you have to like build up tension, because the, you know, like you can be a passive listener, right? Like someone can tell their story and you really should be an active listener, but you could just sit there and hear what we have to say. But to read like that you have to be motivated to turn the page, right? And so Alex Haley has this responsibility to make this a page turning story, right? It's a different motivation. So that tension is in the autobiography. I mean, that isn't even to speak of the multiple voices. Right. Just the format was a challenge for Malcolm, and he wasn't really fond of the autobiography as a genre, because that is about a single person. Right. And he was trying to tell the story of the people through his single person story. And it's kind of like that problem of exemplarity, right? Like, how are you going to be the example without being the exception, right? Because at some point you want to be so standoutish that people are like, this is the example. But if you're too exemplary, then people are like, I can't relate to this, right? And so there's this dance that Malcolm is trying to ground his story in like a community story. Right. And that tension is also present. You can see in the notes that they're going back and forth with in the margins of the manuscript.
Yeah, and I think you touch on something that Schomburg wrote about in The Negro Digs Up His Past, right? He talks about how the exception means that like you will be taken away from the group. Yeah. So even while you are trying to acknowledge the group and you are part of this community, you come out of this community. But the moment that someone says, oh, wait, and when we say someone, oftentimes that means the larger, dominant, mainstream white culture as Malcolm X lived, right? We talked about like he was giving speeches around the world, right? He was giving speeches not only in this country at some of the finest universities, but he was at Oxford. He was deemed as the exception. So the fact that he was always continually invoking the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, right? As if to say, no, this is what grounds me. My spirituality grounds me, right? And resisting. And yet, by the time we get to the actual composition of the text, we see the change in their relationship, right? I just wanted to like throw Mr. Schomburg's name in that. I didn't forget you.
No, you're good. No, I love when you break down Schomburg. You've written one of the finest books on him yet. So.
Oh, thank you.
For me, I think about what Alex Haley had to do with this text, right? So originally he's supposed to be the co-author. It's supposed to be Malcolm X and Alex Haley. And then ostensibly we assume that Alex Haley met Malcolm and was like, wow, this is a really powerful cat, but we believe some very different things. Right. And he wasn't a known author. He wasn't a known quantity at that point. Right. So he's like, how about you make it as told to, right? And so he takes on kind of like a secondary or passive role. But one of the things that really stuck out to me in reading what some folks call like one of the missing chapters was the difference in the voice, right? Yes. So that chapter was delivered about a month and a half before Malcolm makes the comments about the chickens coming home to roost, right? And it's a very fiery chapter. It's almost as if you've watched Malcolm's speech, it's punchy, it's like really deep. It's like, I could see him teaching in Mosque number 7 and you being like, what is the Negro? This is the Negro and this is the true black man, right? Yes. And it's so in your face. Right. And that was supposed to be the structure, right? Or kind of central to the book. And I don't actually think if that structure had held up, that we would appreciate or have the autobiography that we have today. In fact, Haley had to do a lot of massaging and pressing of Malcolm to tell his tale to really make it a story for us, right? So I think that Alex Haley, in spite of some of his political beliefs and maybe even political paid affiliations, right? He's a powerful griot. Because he takes a story and he honors what has come, but he weaves it so everyone who's at the feet of it gets something.
Yes.
And gets something in time immemorial. And that, for me, is a phenomenal act.
Yes, yeah. We all had to read the Lost chapter, right, in preparation for this conversation. I wanted to ask you all what your reactions were to it. Was there anything in there that surprised you? Certainly we're always asked when we talk about historical figures, what would they think today? How does this apply today? My own personal reaction was how very timely that chapter was, and how sadly those things, it's an ongoing conversation, right? The idea of questions about community, questions about consumption, right? Cultural consumption, capitalist consumption in a way to define yourself, in a way to be acceptable or respected in this culture, right? He's dealing with all of that. He's also dealing with what folks need to do in terms of organizing and mobilizing, right? And political activism, and we have to get to how to incorporate folks who don't vote, right? How do we be attractive to folks who don't vote so that we can be taken seriously as a voting bloc? So just wondering your thoughts about that chapter.
Well, in my reading of it, one thing that surprised me towards the end, he was saying we need to start taking action, and he pointed out that around that time there were about 20 million Afro-Americans or black people in the country, but 8 million adults, so 8 million votes, and most of those people did not vote. Mm-hmm. And he was saying that in 1960 election, that Kennedy won by about 115,000 votes. Mm-hmm. He was like, hey, black folks could have elected Nixon instead of Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And so he also pointed out there was some contradictions with Kennedy. He kept talking about how much he loved black people, but once he got in office, it took him 3 years, and it wasn't until black folks got upset in Alabama and started responding to the violence that they were experiencing, and then in Birmingham, and that's when he said he's going to put out the Civil Rights Bill. So he exposed Kennedy on that front. But he was really saying, look, we have a power block, a political block that we can use. That kind of surprised me. That's the way that he was pointing it out in that particular chapter. And Dr. Ali has made the point, and I saw that as well, how many times he kept trying to tell how he was going to prison. Well, I went back and read some of the autobiography that was published, and he kept trying to tip his hat to the reader that, hey, I've gone to prison. And Alex Haley, I think his involvement made the autobiography more of a personal story as opposed to a political treatise. And I think what Alex did, what Mr. Haley had done, was say, look, the power is in the subtlety of the story. You have to tell your story, and through your life and everything you've been through, everyone can relate to it. You don't have to say that, well, black folks have been through here, and why black folks have been through this, and we have to deal with the white devil or change the system. Just by telling your story and people relating to what they've experienced similar to yours, they can see the suffering. You don't have to actually say it like in a preaching sort of way. Just tell your story. And I think Alex Haley's involvement was very helpful in that regards, because he held Malcolm back. And the beauty, so like you watch a Spike Lee movie, sometimes with Spike, you gotta give him credit. He was great in terms of pioneering. Sometimes he beat you over the head with the message. Boom, boom. Malcolm, same thing.
Yes.
You just pull it back. You're not behind the podium. You're not giving a speech in Harlem. You're telling your story. So we had to pull that out of Malcolm. Right. And then you get all of the jazz, the Billie Holiday, Donna Washington, Billy Eckstine. You get all of this stuff coming out of Malcolm, and then you can relate to Malcolm. Yeah. Then he becomes one of us. He's not up high. Right. We see some of the frailties of Malcolm. Right.
Yeah. For me, the chapter was very striking in that the voice of it was really an internal dialogue. It's entitled The Negro, and it's directed at black folks exclusively, right? And he's literally talking about the ways in which Negro as a category of folks who have sold themselves out, who have bought into an idea of white integration and white possibility. And he does address a white audience. One of the things that I think is so smart about it is he's like, these Negro leaders are financed by white folks, are trotted out by white folks in all these ways. And if I was white, I would be pissed. Because these Negro leaders who tell you they have their finger on the pulse of black people couldn't tell you that black folks were about to rise up. Right. Couldn't tell you that black folks were already pissed off. In fact, they kept on telling you things were all right. Right. And Malcolm was like, the fact of the matter is who white folks think is leading black people is not at all.
Right.
So he tells an adage of a group of black folks who are marching down the street, and the Negro leader shows up, and he's running alongside of them, and he's like, hey, y'all, like, I can't lead you if you don't tell me where we're going. Right.
Right.
And that's like quintessential Malcolm.
Right.
But really talking about this leadership class and the ways in which black folks here may have bankrupted ourselves of potential power. So he does that in part through, though I don't agree with everything in his assessment, right, a conversation around immigration, right, and what it is that black folks here have not done that other groups have done or may do. So he goes from Irish folks to Jewish folks to folks from the continent. And so he kind of starts to say, hey, look, if we take these pieces, we can regain our political power. And it is in part through strategic electoral politics that will do this. So it's kind of often represented that the split with the Nation of Islam, post-split, Malcolm became much more interested in electoral politics, that pre-split in the NOI, he thought about politics, but not explicitly. But this chapter really says he was thinking about a black voting bloc. He was talking about those 8 million black folks who didn't vote, but he wasn't shaming them.
Right.
He was saying, in fact, they have a reason not to vote.
Right.
He said to black folks, Democrat and Republican, they mean the same thing. They mean nothing.
Right.
And he said, if there is a leader who can get those folks to vote, it's the Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Right.
And he's saying what we need to do is follow the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and then make those politicians respond to a set of questions which will really induce a black voting bloc and will be courted.
Right.
Now, before the autobiography comes to pass and before his death, he splits from Elijah Muhammad. But the seeds of politics, the seeds of talking about political incorporation, and the seeds of tough talk, but also loving talk are there.
Right.
And sometimes our critiques, whether we be conscious, whether we be woke, whether we be African with a K, sometimes we can talk down and the love gets lost.
Yes. Right.
And I don't think Malcolm ever lost the love.
Right.
No.
Thank you.
No.
Yeah.
You know, there's this one passage that I highlighted where he says in that chapter, he says, the true nature and the true intent of the former slave master is glaring every way and every day in the headlines. And then he has like a line for each of these, right? You can't enter here. You can't ride here. You can't work here. You can't play here. You can't study here. You can't eat here. You can't drink here. You can't walk here. You can't live here. And immediately thought of Eric Garner of I Can't Breathe, right? And all of in the last 4 or 5 years, all of the various black lives of people who have found themselves in places where they just can't be black and be, whether it's shopping or at a pool or at a barbecue or, you know, selling lemonade on the side of the street or whatever it's the you can't. And, you know, Malcolm had this kind of brilliance of being able to speak what people were experiencing, but maybe weren't able to speak for themselves, right? So it isn't that he gave voice to the voiceless because people had voices. He just amplified the voices that he himself had collected over his travels. And that's one of the reasons why he resonated so powerfully. You know, this chapter, The Negro, is rough. I mean, you said he says it with love, but like the first 10 pages of it, he's like,
love,
you know, he's like, you know, white people will have a Cadillac after they have a Cadillac house, after they have a Cadillac job, a Cadillac bank account. He was like, but us, we have a Cadillac car first, before the house, before the bank. And it's like, yeah. You know, like there is and this is part of the black nationalist tradition, right? Which is assuming that we are in the same community so I can speak. It's like, this is family talk, right? But it also embraces a deficient view of black America, right? A pathologized view of black America that is so damaged by the experience of slavery and Jim Crow racism that is in need of repair. And I think, you know, if you go too hard on that, then you kind of don't leave people with any kind of sense of their own resources with which to, you know, to resolve this. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if Malcolm wanted to use a migrant narrative, he could have used a narrative of migrants from the South to the North, which proved themselves just as enterprising, just as economically organizing, just as culturally. In fact, the Nation of Islam is arisen out of Southern migrants to the North. So you didn't have to look at people who were coming to the United States. The immigrant or the migrant ethos is very much present in Black America, that we don't have to feel like we are losing something. We just have to find that historical moment where it's there. And I feel that that's I was just when I was reading this, because he was really beating us up. And I felt like that is within the spectrum of the Black freedom movement. You find there's a kind of declension narrative, right? This idea that we have fallen, right? And this notion that we have fallen is premised on some nostalgic golden era, whether it was, during slavery, people were able to do this, or, back in Africa, we were doing this. And I think that sometimes robs us of the progress narrative, right? Not to be falsely optimistic, but also to understand that, no, we are making progress as a people. And of course, if you're trying to bring an urgency to folks, you bring the apocalypse is here, right? The world has come to an end. It's essentially a make Black America great again, right? That is the declension narrative. No, it is, right? And that's what, Golden Age nationalism had as one of its strong elements. The idea that the original man was this, that, and the next, and had fallen and let us come back, kind of sometimes robs us of the resources we have, with us now.
But I think it also speaks to our lost histories, i.e. we have a history of Black folks. We have always, part of the expansion of this country meant that Black folks were in the West, and we don't have, in the 18th and 19th centuries, we don't have those, right? You have to look for those. You have to look for Nell Painter. You have to look for, scholars who have done this work and go, oh, wait, we did set up, a record number of newspapers, Black-owned newspapers. It wasn't just the Defender and the Amsterdam News and the Courier. We had hundreds of newspapers, right? We had Black businesses. There was a Black Wall Street. There was, and so what struck me when I was reading his words was that, right? He doesn't call on that. Yeah. We do have this, and it's lost even to him. Yeah, right?
He literally, sorry.
No, go.
No, there's a moment where he mentions, benevolent societies among European communities, and I'm like, that's our stuff, literally.
Right, absolutely.
That's how we got free, in many ways.
Yeah. Right, and so whether it's Freemasons or the Elks, we have these groups, right? And so I thought that was really interesting, and as well, and when I saw that litany that you just did, I social media and on Twitter, when everything pops off at any given moment, there's a recording of, oh, we can't go to the pool. Yes, oh, we can't go shopping. Yeah. Oh, we can't go to the Airbnb. Oh, we can't go. And so that was, again, the tragedy for me was, damn, we still here. Yes, there's a progress narrative. Yes. And yet at the same time, white supremacy is going to do what it does.
It's also making progress.
Yeah, how about that?
That's a way.
How about that?
That's a way. We have 2 more minutes of conversation here, but I did want to say for those of you, as you're starting to think about questions, that the microphones are in the back. So with this being our final set, is there anything that you wanted to say about this text, about this lost chapter, about this man and his words, his living legacy as we commemorate his assassination on this day?
I would say I was happy to see when I Googled autobiography, when I typed in autobiography, Malcolm X's autobiography was the first book to come up. I was pleased with that. I would say that I'm pretty certain that Malcolm outgrew the Nation of Islam. It became his, it saved him. It gave him a foundation, but he was extremely intelligent. Not only that, he was his soul, he was elevated as a human being, very spiritual being the 7th child. And he didn't betray us. like, for example, Elijah Muhammad. I mean, you find out, I think Malcolm, one of the things that kind of upsets me, and every time I would watch the documentary on Malcolm X by Honor Pearl that came out in '72, and you get to the assassination piece, and they interview some of the Harlemites after the assassination, you know, I get teary-eyed. That's how emotionally connected I am to Malcolm. I think a lot of people feel that way, especially New Yorkers. And the thing that hurts me is that I'm like, Malcolm should have left. Like, as soon as he found out that Elijah Muhammad was a sexual predator, like, why didn't he leave? But then I think that, well, he probably saw Elijah as like a father figure. It probably made it difficult for Malcolm to leave his father, his spiritual father, in effect. And but the thing that I'm amazed by him is that at the very end, like, you could tell he wasn't a selfish person. You couldn't buy him. Dr. John Henry Clark talks about this, I think a Muslim country or some Muslim group wanted to offer Malcolm over $1 million, and he turned it down. He would not be used in that way. I mean, if he was really not for people in general, but black people in particular, I mean, his life was on the line. And I recall Benjamin Kareem, who was like one of his right-hand men in the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, recounted that Bumpy Johnson, who people in Harlem know about, one of the legendary gangsters, came to Malcolm and said, look, man, I heard you have a problem with the nation. I can handle that for you. Now, you know, and Malcolm was like, hey, I don't want to see two black groups fight. Right. And even with his life on the line, he still would not fight. And I think that's amazing. And he gave his life. Yeah. And so that, to me, he was revolutionary, he was radical. And I think you may have said it earlier, that he still was loving and kind. Yeah. So those things aren't mutually exclusive. Right. So, you know, so I think that's the thing that stands out to me, that he was loving.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. For me, I think revisiting the autobiography reminds me that Malcolm was a principled man, right? But principled doesn't equal perfect, right? The way that many of us talked about coming to the autobiography and what attracted us, and probably many of us in this room, was kind of the dirt that was on Malcolm, right? The things that he did in his past and his attempts to clean himself up and clean his people up, right? Sometimes what happens when you get to the end of the autobiography is that folks have created a perfected figure, right? And then that means any discussion of Malcolm becomes, any critique of Malcolm is actually unallowable because he's unassailable, which is not what I believe he would have wanted at all, right? The man went around the globe debating people. Right. He was constantly trying to refine himself. He was constantly trying to find what was better. For me, I want folks to revisit the autobiography. I want them to read around Malcolm. I want them to be able to find themselves in his narrative and figure out the places where they may need to change their narrative around Malcolm so they can change themselves. Yeah. Right? Too often, I think he becomes a deified figure, but we need him to be divine, but divine enough to touch and transform us again.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
You know, Malcolm's autobiography is a story of self, but it's also a story of us. And it's also a story of urgency, of like what needs to be done. But reading the autobiography in the context of the manuscript and this chapter, The Negro, I come away with a reminder of how it is a construction. It is a product. It is a product that is a collaboration between Malcolm and Haley. And after Malcolm has, been killed, Haley has to complete the book, and so it's a collaboration between Haley and his editors. Right. And that isn't to take away from the authenticity of the autobiography, but it is to acknowledge that when we tell our stories, we choose what facts of our past are important in that moment, and we also choose what not to say. And so I think when you talked about, like, find yourself in Malcolm, but also find yourself in the silences of Malcolm, right? There are things that Malcolm doesn't talk about, and that doesn't mean they aren't relevant to the struggle, right? Malcolm's views of women do not shift radically in the autobiography, but they do shift radically in his life, right? That's right. By the time he establishes the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he is very comfortable having women lead that organization or take a prime role in that organization. That is not reflected in the autobiography. The autobiography is like, you can't trust women, they will trap you. I think he gets to one point, he's like, the one woman that I trusted is Betty, and I only trust her halfway, or something like that, right? Like, it's very, it's deeply patriarchal, right? And, I think that's not something I picked up on. Obviously, as a young man reading it, I was like, yeah, but I think that we have to, see the silences and what isn't said, and then be able to fill it in with our own story as well, that we do kind of have to build on this text. It was written by someone who was born in 1925 and was killed in 1965. Like, it is unfair for us to make this a trans-historical, eternal revelation. It is not, right? And if we're willing to contextualize scripture, then we need to contextualize the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Thank you. Thank you. We have questions. So we have folks standing up. I will ask you all, we'll probably, because we have a limited amount of time, we'll probably take 3 questions at the same time, and then we'll try to answer them. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, right? And then the panel will try to answer. Is that all right, Novella?
That sounds like a great idea.
Okay.
So how y'all doing? My name is...
Oh, I'm sorry, and just one more thing. We want to keep them to questions so that we can go ahead and get through as many of them as possible. Thank you.
Okay, so Malcolm X talked about the fascination between the white woman and the black man, as well as the fascination between the black man and the white woman. I just graduated from college, first person in my family to go to Vanderbilt.
Hey!
And at college, I saw a lot of this similar issues, so I just wanted to know if you guys see it today as well.
Okay. 1.
Second question.
Do you think that Malcolm's zealotry blinded him from Elijah Muhammad's relationships with the young girls, and at the same time, was that at that same time period, he defied Elijah Muhammad's orders as far as speaking out on Kennedy and a couple other things? And that seemed to be the downfall. It all happened like in a very short period of time.
Okay.
And we'll do one more.
Okay, good evening. I have a statement, really. I don't have a...
Okay, so we're going to hold right there. We'll take those first 2 questions.
Well, the gentleman relates to Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm. I think it's a bit more complex than that. You also, when you talk about Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm, you have to also talk about Elijah Muhammad's family. There was always, I think, a certain degree of jealousy there, with the possible exception of maybe like Wharf Dean Muhammad or Wallace Muhammad. And so Elijah Muhammad's family were in Elijah Muhammad's ear a lot. And so they were trying to goad Elijah Muhammad into kind of severing ties with Malcolm. And also, I think that Malcolm was so sincere in his approach. And I think he discovered that Elijah Muhammad wasn't so sincere. Of course, there was some, I think he was blind to some extent, but I think he was really disappointed that Elijah Muhammad wasn't as serious about what he preached as he really was. And so, and then you have to mention the FBI, and they were doing certain things to kind of take advantage of the tension. For example, Elijah Muhammad was sensitive about his age. So the FBI would have journalists who were either on the payroll or influenced, and they would write articles about Malcolm and stress his age, his youth, and versus Elijah Muhammad's age. And that would make Elijah Muhammad upset. And they would, since they were bugging and hearing everything, they knew to take advantage of that to create that schism, which ultimately led to his assassination.
Zaheer, you want to talk about white women?
Why do you do that? Actually, I don't have any expertise on that. Do you?
And you want to know what? That is
Well
the
played,
answer that you should have whenever you do not have the proper information to answer
That's right.
the question. Okay?
I tell my students I don't know that one.
You got it. I missed that, but I'm going to answer the question, right? So Malcolm often talks about this fascination of the distant, the desirable but unattainable. This is part and parcel with white supremacy. That's not new. We still have that existing today, But when we look at the numbers, right, like I think it's around 88 to 89% of black women have black men as partners, right? So sometimes the thing that we see in minority can become so gleaming and take our attention that we miss what is probably the most regular thing. Black love exists. It has before and it continues to exist. So that's where my focus is. I'm not worried about that. That's just not my central worry.
All right, we'll take 2 more questions.
Hi. I'd like to know you all's take on Malcolm X's history as a queer sex worker. Specifically, I'd like your comments on the veracity of those claims, as well as their strategic exclusion from mainstream conversations like this one about Malcolm X.
And the second question? If you don't have one, we'll keep moving.
I was waving to Sister Aisha, Al-Adawiya. Assalamu alaikum. I just want to give my son Ismail a chance to ask a question.
How was Malcolm X's kid life like?
It's a kid.
Well, I think also we had his kid or him?
Like him, Malcolm X.
What was he like as a kid?
I think that's,
okay.
And I would also just throw into that, with Ismail, with that question is, when I was young, when I read it, the beginning of it was like this ecological masterpiece, and it described his relationship to the natural world. And so I'm just curious about Ismail's question and my question.
Okay. Well, on the homosexuality piece, I read that, and for me, like for example, my book, I'm an open book. I think is that vulnerability actually is a sign of strength. It's not a sign of weakness. And I think for men, traditionally, we're just not supposed to be vulnerable, but I think we need to kind of get away from that. But when I read that, so whether Malcolm had sex with somebody in his marriage, out of his marriage, or homosexual encounter when he was young, that doesn't in any way impact his greatness. When I read that, my only issue is that I didn't see enough evidence to, for that to be cited. I would need a little more evidence to cite something that significant about his sexual activity. That was my only concern about it. But whether it was true or not, I really don't care.
Do you want me to weigh in? So I'll weigh in. So I think that sex work has been around, and plenty of folks that we know and love participated in sex work, and there is evidence from Malcolm that he engaged in sex work. Now, herein lies the rub. We allow certain forms of sex work to be accepted on their face. Somebody says, I was a pimp, they're like, cool, you were a pimp.
Right.
Somebody says, oh, they were a powder boy and they did this with something. Well, I need 3 witnesses, I need 15 transcripts, and they all have to confirm. And that's where I think really heteronormativity comes into play,
Absolutely.
right, in our notions of gender.
Absolutely.
I think if the burden of evidence is there, then put it everywhere. If not, then I'm saying, okay, we're not dealing with really the complexity of people's lives and their fullness.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think also, again, there is something to be said about how, if people have this emotional reaction, if, for example, we're talking about someone who people feel like they're their father, right? Then that's what we're jabbing. Oh, you found out something that like maybe you don't know how to deal with. And it does, we have to have those conversations, and we have to say, if all Black lives matter, then all Black lives matter. And then we have to deal with, okay, how does this, if he did sex work with men, which is then how do we feel about that, right? And guess what? We don't feel anything about that, because guess what? This man has been, God bless him, but he's been gone for a little bit. So now, why is it more of a problem to have engaged in that than with him being a pimp? Why is that like, oh, we're okay with exploitation of women, but this part.
And so the other question about Malcolm X as a young man, as well as, I'm sorry, I didn't recall the other part of your question.
Ecological.
Yeah.
So I'll just say, put in a plug for a wonderful book that I read to my daughters, which is Malcolm Little, which is the story of Malcolm X, written by his daughter, that talks about him growing up, his relationship to his parents, and kind of the challenges that he faced when he was no longer able to live with them. How he met teachers and met other folks who sometimes told him that he wasn't allowed to be a lawyer, he wasn't allowed to do certain things because he was Black, but his fight to be whole and to be loved. So it's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
And if you don't have it, I got you.
My name is Beverly Copeland. Under the old Soviet system, voting was strongly encouraged. They had extremely high voter participation rates because constitutionally, under the old Soviet system, the control of the whole political system was in the hands of the political elites. Under the American Constitution, state, federal, and local, the state charters, the local charters, voter participation is suppressed by both Democrats and Republicans. When you vote, you're essentially voting for you're just rubber stamping candidates selected by the leadership in the Democratic and Republican Party. I don't vote as a result. If Malcolm had succeeded, if the Black Panthers had succeeded, if King had succeeded in organizing at a grassroots level, that would have allowed for meaningful voting in America, because you would not just be rubber stamping candidates of the elites in the Democratic or Republican Party. You would be voting for your choice. So I want to say that.
Is there a question in there?
The question is, what do you think it will take for the American system to really be democratic and really be grassroots, really be bottoms up?
Thank you. And your question?
Hi, so like members of the panel, my love affair with Malcolm began as a teenager, reading the autobiography when I was 15. And that love affair was kind of sustained, as you've talked about, through hip-hop, by seeing the images of Malcolm, seeing his words in Boogie Down Productions and X-Clan and all these other groups that just really kind of spoke to me, spoke to my culture, spoke to my time period, and brought Malcolm into that time period. So obviously the hip-hop of today is different. I'm not going to say it's better or worse. It's definitely worse. But I do wonder, for a young man like myself, obviously, who didn't live during the time that Malcolm was alive, but was able to, again, have that sustained through hip-hop and through other means of accessing Malcolm, how do you see young people today to be able to access Malcolm? How do you see his words, right, the images of Malcolm, and all the other ways that we were influenced when we were younger? How does that happen today? How do you think young people can access Malcolm? Because I don't see it or hear it in the music. It's not something that I see kind of being as prevalent as it was when I was a young man.
Do you want?
Whatever, I'll take the other one.
It's interesting, you can actually trace the representations of Malcolm in hip-hop from a very literal, his voice, to metaphors, right? So you go from No Sellout, which samples his actual voice, to someone like Kanye West saying, by any means necessary, like B-U-I, right? So that by any means necessary has become an act of conspicuous consumption. I can't remember the artist who compares Malcolm to a car, right? Like naming like his car, after Malcolm, or the appeal of really Detroit Red more than Malcolm X. And I think that just reflects, I think we can't put on, certainly someone who is not with us, but we can't put on Malcolm the burden of transforming hip-hop or transforming our culture. We have to make that choice, right? Whether it is through our decision of what to patronize, our decision of what to celebrate, what to uphold. Malcolm is not like some magic totem who's like, if you play a Malcolm X speech, like, no, because it wasn't just people went in and heard Malcolm and they woke up. People heard Malcolm in a context, right? If you went into a Nation of Islam mosque, they didn't just let you hear Malcolm walk out the door. They gave you some forms that you had to fill out. They gave you some structure, some institutional culture that, gave you some stuff that you had to do. You had meetings to go to on Monday, on Wednesday, on Thursday, on Sunday. Like, they gave a whole, structure to your life, right? That was the transformative power that accompanied Malcolm's voice, right? And even when he left, he understood the need to build institutions. So he built Muslim Mosque, Inc. He established the Organization of Afro-American Unity. They never had a chance to really get up off the ground, but he really understood that his charisma, and even Elijah, right? Like, if anybody ever heard Elijah speak, he was not Malcolm, but there was this one, I think it was this one writer who goes in to follow Malcolm, shadow Malcolm, and it's a meeting in the Armory in New York City, and Malcolm opens up the meeting, and people are cheering, and the reporter's okay, I get it. And then Elijah steps to the microphone, and the place goes bananas. And the reporter is like, what? Right? Because Elijah was institutionalized charisma, right? Which was the way the Pope is institutionalized charisma. We don't understand the language that the Pope is, but you know that there's something important there. There's something. No, I'm serious. Yeah. James Baldwin said, when he sat with Elijah, he understood the power of him, right? And so we have to understand that hip hop is not just a song. The culture is an institution, and we have to treat our culture as a product of institutions, whether it be record companies, radio stations, all of the kind of accompanying things that make a cultural phenomena attractive. This is not, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but culture is produced, right? It is a production, and we should understand that if we want to change the product, we have to deal with the sites of production.
All right, we're going to let that go. Hit it. Anybody going to respond to the politics?
Yeah. The question of what it would take to politically activate everyone is a question that we've been dealing with now for literally 100 years. What I will say is that we have to think about multiple levels of political engagement, and it's not a single organization that's going to transform this, right? We need a radically different understanding of how we understand democracy and what we read and how we engage. Because even if folks were successful in activating people to get out to vote for slate of candidates, with systems and institutions like the Electoral College, there are limits on that, right? Without an understanding of local politics, what city council does, there are limits on what we can do. So it is about finding candidates, but it's also about political literacy in a very different format, one which I think some organizations do well. Organizations like Movement for Black Lives are doing some of that work. And so that's who I look for that potential, not necessarily a political organization that does not start with a framework of saying electoral politics are essential for our movement.
So we have two more questions, but right before we get to those last two questions, I just want to say a couple of things. One, I definitely recommend people revisiting our conversation, Women Speak About Malcolm X, which was curated by Sister Aisha on May 19th, 2016. You can find it on livestream.com/Schomburg Center. I know that was part of sort of the last part of the conversation before we went to Q&A. And also, as people are leaving, just wanting to remind you that we do have the Autobiography of Malcolm X available in our Schomburg shop. Also, we have Never Stop, which is Simba Asana's memoir, and he will be signing that afterwards because clearly this brother has a story to tell. And so if you wanted to read more about his story, I highly recommend that. So with that, we have Sister Aisha, and then we have one more question after her.
I'd like to thank the panel for a very thoughtful conversation this evening and daring to touch on some subjects that are not always popular to address, but do it we must. As historians, professors, activists, and others, my only plea to you is that when we make assertions about people who have set a path before us, a liberation path, that when we bring assertions about such persons as Malcolm X and others, whatever they may be, that it becomes incumbent on you to produce the evidence, the substantiation, the evidence, and the proof of such assertions so that we can stay true to our mission of speaking truth to power. So again, I thank you for your comments. Thank you so much.
Well, I just wanted to ask, like, what was the start to the path of Malcolm X's death?
Damn,
I just wanted to ask.
Thank you for your question.
Zaheer, you got that one, brother. Oof.
That's
substantiate your assertion here now.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
you know, I think you talked about the complexity. You know, Malcolm was very much a co-creator of a lot of the Nation of Islam's culture. And he bore some of the responsibility for, in fact, he was one to introduce the honorific, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Before it was Mr. Muhammad, right? And he was the one who taught this loyalty to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad to the point where people would bring hurt to folks that violated that loyalty. Some of which Malcolm may have presided over as a minister of the mosque. So the question is, when did this process start, right? In 1959, Elijah Muhammad went to make Umrah, which was the Hajj, the pilgrimage, not in the Hajj season, and he left Malcolm in charge in Chicago. And Malcolm began cleaning house. Which was the first, there was two things that happened from that experience. One, it was clear that Elijah was priming Malcolm for this leadership position should anything happen to him, right? It was clear that he was, put this faith and confidence in Malcolm, not his children, right? And the second thing that came out of that was that the children saw what Malcolm would do. And they decided, people in Chicago decided that we can't have Malcolm X be the successor. So one could say that began one of the strings that led the thread of Malcolm's death. The other is the FBI. We can't forget that the federal government relentlessly pursued Malcolm and the Nation of Islam and black organizations from their very beginning. That even while Malcolm was in prison, his file was created. The first page of his first FBI file was created while he was in prison protesting for the treatment of prisoners in prison. And that when he traveled around the country to set up mosques, for example, when he had a mosque meeting or organizing meeting in Boston in somebody's private home where about a dozen people were in attendance, one person in attendance reported on that meeting to the FBI. And this was in 1952. So that is important. That I would say, if the other things of the disputes within the Nation of Islam were the threads that are, when we look at the beginning of the thread for the core of that rope is the federal government, the New York Police Department, the Bureau of Special Services, or BOSSI, and we should be very mindful that this, just you look at the FBI declaring, black identity extremists, going after Black Lives Matter. We look at the discord sometimes that appears in social media amongst various activists in the various forms of Black Lives Matter, and we think that's personal beef. Well, what do you think people thought was going on between Elijah and Malcolm? Personal beef. But behind the scenes, as you pointed out, the FBI was stoking this. They were exacerbating this. We know they did it with the Panthers. They'd send you a letter allegedly by me talking about you, and then they'd send me a letter allegedly by you talking about me. And then when we meet, I'm giving you the side eye because I got your letter, but you never wrote it, right? And so I think we have to, when we talk about, the thread, we can talk about, look, J. Edgar Hoover's first career-making job, because he was like an attorney in the Attorney General's office, the first case that he built his career on was the deportation of Marcus Garvey, right? And so we could start there with that thread.
And,
I want to say thank you to everyone who participated in the Q&A, and absolutely everybody on our stage. Let's give everyone here a round of applause.
Book TV continues with more nonfiction authors and books. Here's some programs to look out